Thank you very much, Chairman Murkowski, and good morning and welcome Chief Tidwell and Budget Director Tony Dixon. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the fiscal year 2016 budget request for the Forest Service. This is very important to New Mexico. We are home to 7 national forests and 1 national grassland. We are also a hotspot for almost every management issue that the Forest Service faces. The economic activities of timber, mining, grazing, and recreation, the protection of wilderness, watersheds, and endangered species, the impact of disease, drought, and fire. In New Mexico, we're dealing with historic drought and devastating wildfires. The Las Conchas fire in 2011 destroyed over 156,000 acres, half of it in the Santa Fe National Forest. It was New Mexico's largest fire in history, but not for long. In 2012, the Whitewater Baldy fires burned up almost twice as much acreage, 298,000 in the Gila National Forest. And then in 2013, the Silver Fire, 130,000 acres burned, also in the Gila, the 3rd largest fire on record in our state. I commend the Forest Service for their efforts to fight these fires and to repair the damage. The Burned Area Emergency Repair Program was a great help to stabilize the burned-over landscape, clean up cultural and heritage sites, and repair trails. That work continues. Even with these funds, it will take many years, and the changing climate is making this type of fire more likely. More and more trees are dying across the Southwest due to historic drought and increased temperatures. Winter warming has worsened bark beetle outbreaks by allowing more beetles, which normally die in cold weather, to survive and reproduce. Wildfire and bark beetles killed 20% of trees in Arizona and New Mexico forests from 1984 to 2008. The danger is clear and growing. It is crucial to fund programs that reestablish healthy, resilient forests that can withstand fire and disease. And I totally agree with what the chairman said in terms of talking about sustainable forestry. I think that's something that the two of us can agree on and like to work with you on that. And we can't keep borrowing, though, on this Forest Service situation between borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. We have to move beyond the cycle we're stuck in. We can't keep fighting fires with money borrowed from programs that help prevent them. The Forest Service needs to be able to pay for firefighting without gouging its other mission areas. Firefighting now takes 47% of its budget, compared to just 13% in the early 1990s. And that's clearly, Chief, as you know, not sustainable. The disaster cap proposal included in the budget is an opportunity to both stop the borrowing and at the same time dedicate funding to restore our forests. I look forward to talking about how we can work together to get this proposal signed into law. I'm also looking forward to discussing with you a number of the regular proposals in the budget, including a $20 million increase for the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. New Mexico has 2 ongoing collaborative projects. I'd like to talk about how this increase will be used and whether it could help projects in my state. There are other management issues to consider as well. The budget again proposes the consolidation of major accounts within the National Forest System into the Integrated Resource Restoration line item. This began as a pilot program, as you know, Chief, in fiscal year 2012 in the 3 Forest Service regions. That includes all of New Mexico's national forests, which are also undergoing management plan revisions under the new 2012 planning rule. So I hope to hear more about that process. Finally, the budget includes an additional $8 million for forest legacy projects and $15.5 million for land acquisition. New Mexico projects are not included on either list this year, but full support for the Land and Water Conservation Fund is as important as ever. LCWF is vital to protecting our public lands, and I look forward to hearing from you, Chief Tidwell, and to discuss these matters with you this morning. Thank you. Chief, wanted to focus in a little bit on the budget framework as far as fire suppression funding with the new disaster cap adjustment. As you know, this subcommittee worked very hard last year to pass this legislation as part of the 2015 Omnibus Appropriations Bill. Ultimately, we weren't successful, but we didn't give up. The disaster cap is the key to breaking the cycle of fire borrowing and putting an end once and for all for the need to steal funds from land management programs to pay for emergency firefighting needs. Many of the programs that we borrow funding from to fight fires are the same programs that create a more resilient landscape to resist wildfire. Can you talk about how important this proposal is to the administration's overall vision for reducing the threats of wildfires?
Well, Senator, it's essential. As we look at what's happened just over the last 13, 14 years, when the percent of our budget's gone from around 14% to over 40%. If you add hazardous fuels funding into that, it gets over 50% of our budget is now focused on dealing with wildland fire. It has, and under a constrained budget, and as much as I'd like to tell you that the cost of suppression is going to go down in the future, the 10-year average is going to continue to go up. We still have, I think there's 2 years in the 10-year average that are less than $1 billion. When those fall off of the average, you're going to see to see the 10-year average jump up. It's just essential that we find a way to recognize that we need to provide the funding for fire suppression the year that it's occurring. We're going to take whatever actions necessary to suppress fires where we need to suppress fires. And as impactful as it is for us to have to stop operations and transfer funds, we have no choice, but we're going to do that. So we're going to pay for the cost of fire suppression one way or another. So the idea that we could just have a mechanism so that we could pay for it during the current year, instead of shutting down operations and transferring money and then asking for Congress and to repay those funds the next year or the year after. And I appreciate, the Congress's willingness to pay back those funds over the years, but we can't ever replace the time that we've lost. Because often August and September, those are critical field months. And when we shut down operations, we never get that time back. And often a project that even if it's just postponed, we often maybe lose the window to be able to implement it, conditions change on the landscape. And so these are the impacts of this transfer that are very hard for us to quantify. Last year we put out reports for every state that showed the impacts to each state from having to transfer money. But it didn't begin to also capture the impacts of just losing that time on that field season that we lose. So it's essential that this program, we find a way to get this legislation passed in that we no longer have to, transfer, money each year and recognize that a very small percentage, 1% of these fires should be treated as a natural disaster, not unlike other natural disasters that we treat and fund accordingly.
Thank you, Chief. The one thing here that I think is important, we have the budget process coming up. I think it's very important. I hope you pass the message back to Secretary Vilsack and Secretary Jewell that they work with the new budget chairs for the House and the Senate, because I think if we can get it in there, we'll have a much better chance to proceed. In just the little bit of time I have left, we talked yesterday, and thank you for coming into the office, about the Valles Caldera National Preserve. Could you tell us how you've resolved the funding issues there and what you're working on and what you see the plans are for that?
Well, we're working closely with the National Park Service. The lands were transferred last December, and the funding that was provided for the Caldera, we have that ready to be transferred to the Park Service as soon as they have their budget structure set up to handle that. In addition, with the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project that encompass part of the Caldera along with the adjoining national forests, we were not able to transfer CFLR funds to the Park Service, but we are transferring other appropriated funds to the Park Service to be able to continue that work to be accomplished that was planned for this year, to continue to work with the trust that's in the process of implementing the work. And so we have that money set aside, ready to be transferred to the National Park Service. So as far as all the work that was planned to occur this year in the Caldera, that should all go forward as planned.
Great, thank you very much, and we really appreciate the Forest Service and the National Park Service working together to make sure that there's a seamless transition there. Thank you. The Chief, the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institute, which is a collaboration between New Mexico Highlands University, Northern Arizona University, and Colorado State University, and the Forest Service, is a terrific resource of applied research and ideas for improving forest health, preventing wildfires, protecting watersheds, creating jobs connected to national forests. And with increasing effects from climate change, like prolonged droughts and less snowpack in our national forests, there are additional strains on the critical water resources in New Mexico. The Institute, I think, does great work in engaging and educating people in New Mexico on forest and watershed management, and I can't see a better time for them to be doing this kind of work. And despite the benefits to the Forest Service, the funding for the Institute is kind of stagnated in the last 3 years at $1.5 million, even though they've, I think, submitted appropriate and timely projects. Do you feel this level of funding is adequate for the good work the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes do? And is the funding for the 3 individual institutes based on their annual submissions of projects, or is it just based on historic levels of an archaic formula, and can you do more to support the other 2 programs?
Well, Senator, just like with so many of our programs, we've had to make some very difficult choices about setting priorities with our constrained budget. And where I would wish we could provide additional funding, for the Institute, I do feel that the funding we are providing allows them to be able to continue their programs. They've been very helpful in the past, especially when they first started to pull the information together about the different treatments we need to do with ponderosa pine in different parts of the Southwest. Your questions about water, drought that needs to be addressed is another good reason for this institute, to continue. And we leave it up to the institute to decide, the funding between the different facilities. But I feel that this is a good balance for where we are right now. In the future, if we once again can get into a different budget situation, no longer having to put so much of our budget into fire, that this would also provide us an opportunity to expand these programs.
And that's why I led with the fire cap situation, because I think we need to work with you on that. So the other good programs that are going on in the Forest Service budget, that they're able to be funded. Shifting now to the collaborative forest landscape restoration, New Mexico is home to 2 of the 23 current collaborative forest landscape restoration projects. By all reports, these projects are succeeding in improving habitat and watershed quality, creating employment for youth and adults from nearby pueblos, Indian Native American pueblos, and increasing timber production. The President's budget calls for an increase of $20 million for the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, from $40 million to $60 million. What are your plans for the additional funding requested? Will you start new projects or provide higher levels of funding to existing projects?
Senator, it'll be both. With the success we're having with the 23 projects, there's a need to provide some additional funding to those 23, but at the same time, we also want to expand and be able to look at adding additional projects online, recognizing that all of these projects, it takes a few years for them to become fully effective, and that's what we're seeing with the projects that we've had online now, some of them for 5 years, some for 3 years. And the report that we'll be sharing next week it'll show the accomplishments that we're making. These exceeded, when it comes to acres of restoring our forest vegetation, the key output of timber is exceeded. Areas about dealing with road conditions is an area we need to expand work in, and also in noxious weeds. Another target area is another area, but when we've talked to all of these 23, they all feel very confident they're going to meet their 10-year goals. So we want to use this report that we'll be sending up as just another reason why we should expand this program. It is really making a difference. The other key thing is that many of these projects, without this program, and this comes from the members of the collaboratives, they'll tell you that without this, there was no way we would have been able to look at doing projects on 10,000, 20,000 acre areas without extensive appeals and objections or lawsuits. That's the other benefit of this program. The way it's designed, the collaborative requirements there, that it has gone a long way to reduce any of the conflict and controversy and allows us to be able to do these projects on much larger scales. And that's an additional benefit.
Yeah, and you really hit it on the head. I think the two projects in New Mexico, the Southwest Jemez Mountains project and the Zuni Mountains project near Gallup, New Mexico, they have worked collaboratively, and where you may have had a situation where there was litigation or it was slowed down, because of this collaborative work, they've been able to move forward. So we appreciate all the good work there. Just a couple of more questions here, Chief, from me. As you're probably aware, and I think we talked about it a little bit yesterday, my state has a unique history with early Spanish settlers who received land grants from the King of Spain. We're talking now going back 400 years in that range. And these grants were subsequently recognized under Mexican law and finally, to an extent, by the United States under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the end of the Mexican-American War. These non-Indian traditional communities still practice activities they've practiced with their families for generations. They do things like harvesting piñon nuts in the forest. They collect latillas, which are utilized in buildings. They gather wood for heating in the winter and a variety of other projects. And most of the original land-grant lands now overlap with federal public lands primarily managed by the Forest Service. And so it's important that these activities are considered during the current management plan revision process. As you know, your forest management plans are going through a revision in New Mexico, and that's happening in all of our national forests. So will you commit to work with the land-grant heirs in New Mexico to provide reasonable access and consultation on land management decisions?
Senator, yes. Our forests are already reaching out to these folks to make sure that they're involved in the forest planning. I think on the Cibolo, they even have them signed up as a cooperating agency, which I think is probably even the best way for us to be able to move forward. So we can make sure that we're factoring in their traditional uses of the land in our planning. So I feel very confident that we'll be able to work closely with them to be able to continue these traditional uses.
Great, thank you very much. And Chief, this is also related because, as you probably know, related to the last question, we have a large bilingual Hispanic population. I think the number's more than a third of the households in New Mexico, Spanish and English is spoken in the home. And many listen to Spanish language radio and watch Spanish language TV. Can you talk about the Forest Service's bilingual outreach to Hispanic families and Hispanics in New Mexico? And if you're familiar with that?
Yes, Senator, we've increased our efforts to not only our written products that are also produced in Spanish, but also to increase the opportunity where if we need a translator in discussions we're having, whether it's with grazing permittees or just with operators. Many of our employees in your state are also Spanish speaking, and so we're fortunate that we have that level of diversity in our workforce. But we wanted to take every effort that's necessary so that there are ways to that everyone understands the full benefits of their national forests, about how to take advantage of this, to understand the rules and the regulations. And we know that we have to increase our efforts to make sure that we are communicating. And in your case, we're trying to make sure that all of our written materials also is put out in Spanish, and at the same time to make sure we have the language skills that are necessary to be able to communicate effectively.
Yeah, we actually have a constitutional requirement in New Mexico for bilingual materials at the state level to show how much that Spanish history is reflected in our Constitution. Let me also just ask a quick question about, there's an issue with the Las Conchas fire. It was being started by a downed power line, which brings up the issue of maintaining rights of way on Forest Service land that's really, really critical. And I just wonder, is the Forest Service working with utilities to ensure that fires like the Las Conchas will never happen again, even without setting aside funding specifically for partnerships to do that? And this working with these co-ops, and I think you're familiar with this issue.
Yeah, Senator, a few years ago, we increased our efforts to work with the utility companies to be able to work with them not only to ensure that their right-of-ways are cleared of hazardous materials and reduce the potential of a tree coming down on their lines, but also to work with them to be able to expand doing fuels treatment beyond the right-of-ways. That many of the companies recognize that even a fire that doesn't take down a line, if they have to shut it down because of the smoke impact, for whether it's a few days or a week, that it reduces not only the effectiveness of the line, but it reduces their ability to collect revenues off of that line. So we are actually expanding our work beyond just the right-of-ways, but actually to work with them in a partnership to be able, when they have their equipment in there, to be able to address larger areas to reduce the fuels, to eliminate those tragic situations when we do get a power line that comes down and it starts a fire.
Great. Chairman Murkowski mentioned the Coast Guard C-130Hs and what you're working on there. I also believe it's urgent that we try to get your airplanes up and running, especially now that we're going to be heading into the fire season again. So however we can help on that, we really want to get that moving. And I have a couple of other questions I'll submit for the record. They involve cuts that involve research and things like that, which I'm sure have been caused by the situation we have with the firefighters and your forest fire funding in your agency. We have a situation where you have to pull money out to fight fires, and so some of the other crucial areas are cut. So I'll submit those for the record and really appreciate the hearing today, Madam Chair.